The gun was already cocked when Mabel Reed finally understood that she had never once, in all her 26 years of living, made a single choice that was truly her own. She stood in the center of the Dusty Creek Sheriff's office with her hands pressed flat against the rough-hewn desk, staring across it at the man who had just ridden 3 days through the Nevada desert to claim her, her husband, Gerald Holt, and she felt something inside her go very, very still. Not the stillness of peace. The stillness of a woman who has been running so long that her legs have finally given out beneath her. "You are coming home," Gerald said, not asked. Never asked. Gerald Holt did not ask things of Mabel. He announced them. He decreed them. He pointed at her like she was livestock that had wandered from its pen and expected her to trot back docilely, head down, eyes on the dirt. "I have ridden hard and I am not in a mood for your foolishness." Mabel looked at the man she had married at 19, the man her father had selected because he owned 200 acres outside of Carson City and paid the family's debts, and she thought, "I do not know you. I have never known you, and worse than that, you have never once wanted to know me. You will not touch her." The voice came from the doorway, low, certain. Not a threat so much as a statement of immovable fact, the way a man might announce that the sky was blue or the river was running cold. Warren Mercer filled the frame with a quiet that was more dangerous than noise. He was the sheriff of Dusty Creek, Nevada, and he had been standing outside that door long enough to hear every word Gerald Holt had spoken. His hat was in his hand. His badge caught the afternoon light. And his dark eyes were fixed on Gerald Holt with an expression that made the older man's bluster falter for the first time. "This is between a man and his wife," Gerald said, his voice attempting authority and missing it by a mile. "Not in my town," Warren said. "Not like this." And in the crackling silence that followed, in the space between Gerald's fury and Warren's steadiness, Mabel felt something she had not felt in years, perhaps had never truly felt at all. She felt like she mattered. She felt like her presence in the room was something worth protecting. She felt, impossibly, like someone was standing between her and the oncoming storm, not because they had to, but because they wanted to. She had arrived in Dusty Creek 11 days ago with a carpetbag, a bruised wrist she kept hidden beneath her sleeve, and absolutely no plan beyond the fact that she could not spend one more night under Gerald Holt's roof. Now she stood in the center of a confrontation that would determine whether the thin, fragile life she had begun to build here would survive the next 5 minutes. She had not come to Dusty Creek looking for Warren Mercer. She had not come looking for anything except breathing room. But he had asked her something 3 days after her arrival, something so simple it had stopped her where she stood, something so utterly foreign that her throat had closed up around an answer she could not yet form. He had asked her if she was happy here, and she had realized, with a clarity that hit like ice water, that nobody had ever thought to ask her that before. Mabel had grown up in Carson City, the second of 4 daughters born to Thomas and Edna Reed, a family that wore respectability like a coat that was 2 sizes too small, always pulling at the seams, always slightly uncomfortable, but worn regardless because taking it off was unthinkable. Thomas Reed was a schoolteacher who believed in order, in propriety, in the careful management of his daughters as future assets to be placed in appropriate households. Edna Reed was a woman who had learned long ago to agree with her husband in all things, and she had passed this survival strategy down to her children like an inheritance, a dark gift wrapped in quiet suffering. Mabel had been the one who asked too many questions, the one who read too many books borrowed from the schoolhouse shelves, the one who sometimes stood at the kitchen window watching the mountains go purple in the evening light, and felt a longing in her chest so specific and so large that it frightened her, because she could not name what she was longing for. She was 19 when Gerald Holt came to dinner for the 3rd time in 2 weeks, and she was 20 when she understood that her opinion on the matter had never been a factor anyone intended to consult. Her father shook Gerald's hand. Her mother cried a little, the good kind of tears, she said. Her sisters looked at her with something between envy and relief. envy that she had been chosen first, relief that it was not them. The first year was not terrible. Gerald was not a monster, not in the way of fists and broken things. He was a monster in the way of erasure, slow, methodical, so thoroughly convinced of his own centrality that he simply did not see her as a full human being with preferences and fears, and a life happening inside her head. He did not see her at all except as a function. He spoke at her rather than to her. He made decisions about the house, about money, about travel, about every dimension of their shared existence, and presented them as facts already settled. When she offered an opinion, he looked at her with a mild, patient confusion, the way a person looks at a piece of furniture that has unexpectedly tried to speak. And the most devastating part was this: he was not unusual. He was, by the standards of 1879 in Carson City, Nevada, a perfectly acceptable husband. He did not drink to excess. He provided. He was present enough to be a husband in name and in deed, and absent enough in emotional terms that Mabel had spent 6 years learning to occupy as little space as possible inside her own marriage. The bruise on her wrist had come from a disagreement about money. She had asked carefully, gently, whether they might set aside a small amount each month, not much, just enough for her to purchase fabric and supplies, because she had been quietly, secretly, making dresses for women in the community, and they had been paying her, and she had a small sum hidden in a tin behind the woodpile that represented the first thing in her adult life that was solely hers. Gerald had found the tin. He had not struck her across the face. He had grabbed her wrist hard enough to leave a bruise and looked at her with a fury that was all the more frightening because it was so controlled. "You have been conducting business behind my back," he had said. "I have been making something for myself," she had said, and she was honestly surprised by her own words, by the steadiness of her voice, by the fact that she did not immediately retract them. He had given the money to his brother the following morning, every coin. She had waited until he rode out to check his eastern fence line 3 days later. She had packed what she could carry. She had told no one, because there was no one who would have helped her rather than sent word to Gerald immediately. And she had walked to the stage depot and bought a ticket with the last 40 cents she had kept in the hem of her dress, because she was not entirely without foresight, and she had ridden the stage east through the desert with her heart hammering so hard she thought the other passengers must be able to hear it. She chose Dusty Creek because it was the end of the line for the stage she had boarded. She chose it because she did not know a single soul there, and this felt like safety rather than loneliness. She chose it, perhaps, because some part of her understood that starting over required a place that held no memory of who she had been. Dusty Creek in 1879 was a town of perhaps 400 people, built along a stretch of the Southern Pacific's expanding rail line, and sustained by silver ore coming out of the mines to the north, and cattle coming down from the ranches to the east. It had a main street with a handful of businesses, 2 saloons, a church that doubled as a schoolroom, and the kind of dust that got into everything and settled nowhere, and followed you home regardless of how carefully you closed the door. Mabel had walked off the stage with her carpetbag and stood in the middle of the street and looked at the raw wooden storefronts and the horses at their hitching posts and the wide, relentless Nevada sky pressing down on everything, and she had breathed in the hot, dry air that smelled of horses and dust and distance, and she had thought, "Nobody knows me here. Nobody knows who I was. I can be anyone." She found work at Mrs. Eliza Booth's boarding house within 2 hours of arriving, helping with the cooking and cleaning in exchange for a small room on the 2nd floor and meals. Eliza Booth was a widow of 60 who had come west with her husband 20 years ago and stayed after he died because, as she told it, she had already come this far and wasn't about to let a little thing like widowhood send her backward. She had a sharp tongue and a kinder heart than she ever let on, and she looked at Mabel with the practiced eye of a woman who had seen many girls arrive in many towns under many circumstances, and she asked no questions except practical ones. It was Eliza who had pointed Mabel toward the general store owned by Howard Pine, when she needed thread and fabric to continue her work. It was the general store that had first brought her to Warren Mercer's attention, and not in the romantic way that stories often engineered these things. She had simply been standing at the fabric counter when two men outside had gotten into an argument that escalated past words, and the sound of the first punch had sent everyone in the store ducking, and Mabel had stayed absolutely still, not from fear, not entirely, but from a kind of grim familiarity with raised voices that told her keeping still was safer than moving. And when the sheriff had come through the door 30 seconds later, all calm efficiency, breaking up the fight with a firm grip and an even firmer voice that somehow kept everything from escalating further, she had watched him from behind the bolt of calico and thought, "That is a man who knows exactly where he is and what he is doing." Warren Mercer was 31 years old, born in Texas, raised in the complicated, beautiful landscape of a state that contained multitudes, and he had come to Dusty Creek 4 years ago when the previous sheriff retired, and the town council had been recommended his name by a marshal out of Reno who said Warren was the most level-headed man he had ever seen wear a badge. He was not particularly tall, but he carried himself with a quality of presence that made him feel larger than his physical dimensions. He had dark hair that needed cutting and never quite got cut, dark eyes that had the habit of seeing more than people intended to show, and hands that were capable of both holding a gun and, as Mabel would come to notice, carefully patching up a stray dog that had wandered into town with a cactus spine embedded in its paw. That was the second thing she had noticed about him. He had come out of his office to find her on the boardwalk 3 days after her arrival, looking at the mountains in the distance with an expression she was not aware she was wearing, a mix of wonder and grief and something unnameable. And he had sat down on the bench outside his office with that injured dog in his lap and a pair of small pliers, and he had worked quietly for several minutes before he said anything at all. And when he finally spoke, he had not said what she expected. He had not said, "Where are you from?" or "Are you the woman staying at Eliza's?" He had looked up from the dog's paw and looked at her directly and said in a voice that was entirely without artifice, "Are you happy here?" The words hit her somewhere below the sternum. She had opened her mouth and closed it and opened it again. She had felt the absurd, mortifying sting of tears behind her eyes and blinked them back viciously. "I have only been here 3 days," she finally managed. "I know," he said. "That wasn't the question I was asking." She stared at him. He looked back at her with those dark eyes that saw too much and waited. He was, she would come to understand, an extraordinarily patient man. He never asked a question he did not mean to wait for an answer to. "Nobody has ever asked me that before," she said. And she meant it as a deflection, as a way of sidestepping the question itself. But the moment the words were out of her mouth she heard their truth, and it cracked something open in her chest that she had not known was sealed shut. Warren looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked back down at the dog and gently extracted the spine and set the creature on the boardwalk, and it licked his hand once and trotted off with barely a limp. "That seems like an important thing," he said quietly, "to be asked." She had gone back to Eliza's that evening and sat on the edge of her small bed in her small room with its window that looked out over the scrubby desert toward the distant mountains, and she had asked herself the question he had asked her. "Are you happy here?" And then the larger question beneath it, the one that question was really asking, "Have you ever been happy anywhere?" And then the even larger question beneath that one, the terrifying one, the one she had been burying under propriety and duty and the daily mechanics of survival for 6 years. What would it mean to be happy, and what would you have to be brave enough to do to get there? She had no answers. But she had the questions now, alive and restless in her chest, and that was more than she'd had the morning before. The days that followed were a careful, gradual unfolding, like a flower that has been kept in the dark learning slowly that there is sunlight, and that sunlight does not burn. Mabel continued working for Eliza, and she continued her sewing, which Eliza noticed and admired and immediately began telling every woman in Dusty Creek about, which resulted in Mabel having 3 commissions within the week: a church dress for Ida Carpenter, alterations on a wedding suit for Doc Hensley's wife, and a request from Clara Finch at the millinery for help with some decorative needlework that Clara had too many orders and not enough hands to complete. She was good at what she did. She was precise and creative, and she worked with an attention and care that transformed fabric into something beyond its raw material. And there was something about being paid for work she had chosen, with her own hands, with her own skill, that made her feel more substantial somehow, more real, more present in her own life than she had been in years. She saw Warren Mercer every couple of days, as a town of 400 people and a boarding house 3 doors down from the sheriff's office made inevitable. He would tip his hat to her in the street. He stopped by Eliza's once for Sunday supper, which Eliza hosted for various members of the community on a rotating basis, and he sat across the table from Mabel and talked mostly with the other boarders and with Eliza. But once, when a silence fell, he had asked her how her work was going, and she had told him about Ida Carpenter's dress and the challenge of the embroidery pattern, and he had listened with the whole of his attention. Which was the kind of listening that made you feel like the most interesting person in the room. She was not accustomed to it. It made her slightly breathless and slightly suspicious, which was an uncomfortable combination. "You don't have to watch me like that," he said one afternoon, 10 days after her arrival, when they had ended up walking in the same direction down the main street toward the post office. "Like what?" she said. "Like you're waiting for me to turn into something else," he said. "Like whatever you see right now is probably a performance and the real version is less kind." She stopped walking. He stopped too and looked at her without offense or defensiveness, just with that straightforward seeing quality that she was beginning to understand was simply the way he engaged with the world. "I apologize," she said. "That is not a particularly fair way to look at someone who has given me no reason for it." "No apology needed," he said. "I just wanted you to know you don't have to. Here, with me," he paused. "I also want you to know that if you're in some kind of trouble, the offer of help from this office stands regardless of whatever the trouble looks like. That's not charity, that's just the job." She looked at him for a moment. "And if the trouble followed me here?" "Then we deal with it when it arrives," he said simply. She almost told him then, about Gerald, about the tin of money and the bruised wrist and the 6 years of slow erasure. She could feel the words pressing up against the inside of her ribs, wanting out. But the habit of self-containment was deep and well-practiced, and she only nodded and thanked him, and they continued on to the post office in a silence that was, somehow, not uncomfortable at all. Gerald Holt arrived on the morning of the 11th day. Mabel was coming out of the general store with a spool of thread and 2 lengths of blue cotton when she saw him ride down the main street on his gray horse, and the sight of him hit her like a plunge into cold water. The shock of it, the recognition, the immediate and absolute understanding that whatever small, tender thing she had been building here was now threatened. She stepped back into the shadow of the store's overhang and watched him dismount and look around the street with the proprietary expression of a man who owns things. He had always had that expression, like every room he entered was already his. He asked a man by the water trough something, and the man pointed toward Eliza's boarding house, and Mabel's stomach turned to stone. She went directly to the sheriff's office. Warren looked up from his desk when she came in, and he saw her face, and he was on his feet before she had said a word. "Tell me," he said. She told him, all of it. The compressed, rapid version, the marriage, the years, the tin of coins, the bruised wrist, the stage ticket in the hem of her dress, the choice to come here knowing she had no legal standing to simply leave a husband, knowing that under the law of Nevada Territory and almost every other territory and state in the Union, a wife was property in all but the most explicit language. knowing that Gerald had every social and legal right to demand her return, and that no one was obligated to help her and most people would not. Warren listened to every word. He did not interrupt. He did not look at her with pity or with judgment. He looked at her with that steady, focused attention that took in everything and processed it quietly. "Okay," he said when she finished. "Okay," she repeated. "He is going to come here," Warren said. "When he does, I want you in this office." "You cannot legally prevent him from taking me," she said. She needed him to understand she was not naive about this. Under current law, he has a claim. Under current law, a man also cannot intimidate a woman in my office with a drawn weapon, Warren said, and there was something in his voice that was very quiet and very certain. "I have latitude in how I interpret my duty to this town's safety, Mabel. I intend to use it." She had not yet noticed that he had used her given name. She noticed it now. It sounded different from how Gerald said it. Gerald said it like a label, like stamping a crate for shipping. Warren said it like it was something that belonged to her. Gerald arrived at the sheriff's office 40 minutes later. He did not knock. He came through the door with the confidence of a man who had never encountered a room he wasn't welcome in, and he found Mabel standing beside Warren's desk and Warren standing between them, and his eyes went hard and cold. That was when he had said the words that would ring in Mabel's ears for years afterward. "You are coming home." And Warren had said, from the doorway he had stepped to when he heard the horse outside, "You will not touch her." The silence after those words was very full. Gerald Holt was 52 years old, and he had spent the better part of that life getting what he wanted through the simple force of certainty. If he was certain enough, if he was loud enough, if he moved forward without hesitation, people stepped out of his way. It was a strategy that had always worked. But Warren Mercer had the particular quality of not stepping aside, not because he was belligerent, but because he had genuinely calculated the situation and genuinely believed he was right. And a man who is both calm and right is a remarkably difficult thing to move. "Sheriff," Gerald said, and his voice was controlled but barely. "I do not believe you understand the situation." "I understand it clearly," Warren said. He moved to his desk, not past Gerald, not around Gerald, but simply with the ease of a man navigating his own office, and he sat down and looked up at Gerald from behind the desk and said, "Your wife came to Dusty Creek of her own will. She has been here 11 days, and in that time she has committed no crime and caused no trouble and contributed to this community. She is under my office's protection while she is within the limits of this town." "You have no legal basis to say that," Gerald said. "I have the legal basis of the peace and safety of this town's residents, temporary and permanent," Warren said. "Mrs. Holt has told me of an incident of physical restraint that resulted in injury prior to her departure from your household. That is something I take seriously, and I want you to understand me very clearly, Mr. Holt. While I am bound by the law, I am also bound by my own judgment of what constitutes the protection of persons under my care. If you would like to resolve this through legal channels, you are welcome to ride to the nearest county courthouse and file whatever paperwork you believe is appropriate. I will not prevent that. What I will prevent is you walking out of this building with her under duress today." Gerald looked at him for a long time. Then he looked at Mabel. His expression was the one she had always feared most, not rage, but the cold, appraising look of a man recalibrating his tactics. "This is not over," he said. "Most things aren't," Warren said. Gerald left. The sound of his horse moving away down the street was the loudest silence Mabel had ever heard. She sat down very suddenly in the chair across from Warren's desk because her legs had stopped cooperating. He reached under the desk and produced a tin cup and poured water from a pitcher on the windowsill and set it in front of her without comment. She drank it. Her hands were shaking slightly. "He will go to a lawyer," she said. "He might," Warren said. "But lawyers cost money and take time, and the law around spousal abandonment is less absolute than people believe, especially when there's evidence of harm. I spoke with Judge Aldrich in Reno by telegraph wire last month on a different matter. He is not unsympathetic to women in exactly these circumstances. She looked at him. You planned for this before Gerald arrived. After you told me your situation, I prepared as best I could, he said. That seemed like the right thing to do. Why? She asked. The question hung in the air. He looked at her for a moment, and there was something in his expression that was carefully honest, carefully steady. Because it was the right thing to do, he said. And because whatever you're building here, the work, the life, it matters. You matter. And somebody needed to say so. She looked at the tin cup in her hands for a long time. Eliza, when Mabel got back to the boarding house and told her what had happened, produced a bottle of cooking sherry that she kept in the kitchen for medicinal purposes and poured 2 glasses and said, "Well, good, and then? That man has been the best thing to happen to this town since the railroad, and I will argue that point with anyone who disagrees. Drink your sherry." Mabel drank her sherry. Gerald Holt stayed in Dusty Creek. He took a room at the less reputable of the town's 2 saloons, the one that had rooms upstairs and didn't ask questions, and he made his presence felt in the way of a man who wants to be noticed, who wants his absence to be a looming threat. He rode past Eliza's boarding house. He watched the post office. He stood at the bar at the 3 Aces and told anyone who would listen that his wife had been taken in by bad influences, and he intended to bring her home where she belonged. What he did not reckon with was the particular character of Dusty Creek. The town had about it the quality of a place that had been built by people who had come west for reasons, many of them difficult ones, and who had developed in consequence a robust appreciation for the concept of minding your own business while simultaneously keeping a sharp eye on your neighbor's welfare. It was a paradox that Mabel would come to love about it. People left you alone, but they watched out for you. They did not interfere, but they noticed. Howard Pine at the general store began keeping an eye out and telling Mabel when Gerald passed. Clara Finch at the millinery started walking with Mabel when her errands took her down the main street. Eliza Booth put an extra lock on the back door and gave Mabel the key with the efficient manner of someone crossing a task off a list. And Warren Mercer made visible rounds past Eliza's every morning and every evening, which was not unusual for a sheriff making his rounds, except that he had never done it quite so consistently before Mabel's arrival. She noticed all of it. She felt it accumulating around her like something she had no word for at first, and then the word came to her one afternoon while she was hemming the skirt of Ida Carpenter's church dress by the window of her room with the afternoon light coming in gold and warm. Community. She felt held by community. She had never felt that before either. Gerald had been in town 4 days when he did something that shifted the situation entirely. He went to see Judge Patterson, the local justice of the peace, not Aldrich in Reno, and filed a complaint demanding the return of his wife under the principle of marital obligation. Patterson, who was 68 years old and held views about women and marriage that had not updated significantly since his youth in Tennessee, was inclined to be sympathetic. Warren received the notice of the filing and came to find Mabel at Eliza's that evening. He knocked at the front door like a gentleman, and Eliza let him in, and they sat in the parlor, all 3 of them, and he explained the situation clearly. "Patterson could order you to return," he said. "That is a real possibility. I don't want to tell you otherwise. And you would have to comply with that order," Mabel said. "I would be bound by it," he said. "Yes." She looked at her hands in her lap. The bruise on her wrist had faded to yellow and pale green, almost invisible now. She covered it with her other hand without thinking. Warren noticed. He always noticed. "There is another option," he said carefully. "I have been in contact with a lawyer in Carson City, not through Gerald's circles, through other channels. His name is Philip Drummond, and he has worked on similar cases. The law is changing slowly in ways that create some protection. Nevada has more progressive statutes than many territories. If you are willing to file a legal separation citing evidence of physical harm and the unreasonable control of your financial independence, there is an argument to be made." It would not be certain, but it would create a counter to Patterson's order. What would that cost, she asked, because money was always part of it, the calculus of leaving, the arithmetic of freedom. Drummond has agreed to work on a deferred payment with my personal guarantee on the initial costs, Warren said. The room was very quiet for a moment. You cannot do that, Mabel said. You hardly know me. He looked at her steadily. I know enough, he said. Eliza, who had been sitting in her armchair with her hands folded and her expression carefully neutral, made a very small sound that might have been approval and might have been the armchair creaking and was probably both. I cannot accept charity, Mabel said. It is not charity, Warren said. It is a loan to be repaid at your convenience and in whatever increment is possible, and it is a choice I am making of my own free will, fully informed because I believe it is right. He paused. Mabel, you asked me once why I was helping you. Part of the answer is that this is my job, but I want to be honest with you about the rest of it because I think you deserve honesty more than most people I've met. She looked at him. Her heart had gone very still and very attentive, the way it did when something important was about to be said. I care about what happens to you, he said, not in the capacity of sheriff. Not in any official capacity. I care about it personally, and I have since the moment I watched you stand on that boardwalk looking at the mountains like you were trying to memorize something you weren't sure you'd get to keep. He stopped. I recognize that is perhaps not the most appropriate thing for me to say given your circumstances, and I am not saying it to place any expectation on you. I'm saying it because I don't want to hide it from you, because I think you've had enough things hidden from you. She was silent for what felt like a very long time. That is, she finally said, the most honest thing anyone has said to me in 6 years. I mean it to be, he said. I don't know what I feel, she said carefully. I know what it means that you said it, and I know that it means something to me that you said it, but I do not have words for more than that right now. I don't need more than that, he said. Not right now. I just needed you to know. Eliza, who was definitely awake and definitely listening, said, Well, now that that's settled, we should discuss the letter to Drummond. The legal process was slow and grinding in the way of all legal processes, and Gerald was not gracious about any of it. He hired Patterson's brother-in-law, a man named Corbin who fancied himself a lawyer despite having read only half the books that would technically have qualified him for that description, and Corbin filed counterarguments to Drummond's filings, and for 3 weeks Mabel existed in a state of suspended uncertainty that she managed by working. She worked constantly. Her hands were never still, the needle always moving, the fabric always taking shape under her fingers. She made a dress for Clara Finch's daughter's engagement celebration, a lovely thing in gold wool that Clara said made her daughter look like a painting. She altered the wedding suit for Doc Hensley's wife and received a payment that was more than she had charged, with a note that said simply, Fine work deserves fair compensation. She took on 2 new commissions from women she had not yet met who had heard about her through the relay of small-town talk. She saved every cent, and in the evenings, sometimes, Warren would come by Eliza's and they would sit on the porch in the last of the light, and they would talk. Not about the legal process, not about Gerald. There was plenty of other time for that. They would talk about the things that made them who they were. She told him about the mountains in Carson City that she had watched from the kitchen window. He told her about growing up in Texas on his family's cattle operation, a middle child among 5 who had discovered early that he was best suited to the space between things, to the mediation and the keeping of peace, to the work of maintaining order not through force, but through the kind of steadiness that people instinctively trust. She told him about the books she had read as a girl, the ones she had borrowed from her father's schoolroom shelf, novels and histories, and anything she could get her hands on that described a world larger than Carson City. He told her about the books he kept in his office, a small but carefully chosen collection, a history of the legal codes of the Western Territories, 2 novels he had read so many times the spines were broken, and a volume of poetry he had found in a dead man's saddlebag once and kept, because it seemed wrong to let it be lost. He recited something from it one evening, unprompted, watching the sky go from orange to deep violet. A verse about the particular quality of desert light at dusk, how it made everything look briefly like it was made of something precious. She had turned to look at him and he had been looking at her, and neither of them had spoken for a long moment. And then a horse had whinnied from the street and broken the spell, and they had both laughed a little, breathless and sheepish, and the evening had moved on. She was falling in love with him. She knew it with the same terrible, wonderful clarity with which she had known the other fundamental truths of her life. The way she had known at 19 that she did not want to marry Gerald. The way she had known at 26 in the moment before she packed her bag that staying would kill something essential in her. She knew it in her bones and in her chest, and in the peculiar way she woke up each morning with something that was not dread, something lighter and more frightened and more alive than dread. She was falling in love with him, and she was terrified of what that meant, because love, in her experience, was the thing they used to contain you. Love was the reason you stayed. Love was the chain dressed up in the language of devotion, and she had worn it willingly and without complaint, and it had cost her 6 years of her own life. The idea of choosing it again, of walking back toward the fire, required a quality of trust in herself that she was not sure she possessed. She told Eliza this one evening haltingly over the washing up. Eliza was quiet for a while, running a cloth over a plate with the methodical calm of a woman who has thought hard about things. "The question," Eliza finally said, "is not whether love is always safe. It never is. The question is whether the love you're looking at has the same architecture as the trap you walked out of, or whether it's something with a different structure entirely." She set the plate down. "From where I'm sitting, the man has done nothing but ask your opinion and stand between you and harm and pay a lawyer out of his own pocket. That is a different architecture." "He might change," Mabel said. "He might," Eliza agreed. "People do in all directions, but you're not 19 and without choices this time, Mabel. You have income, you have skill, you have a community that would speak for you. The fear you are feeling right now is the reasonable, intelligent fear of someone who was hurt. It is not prophecy." Mabel washed the next plate in silence. "When did you become so wise?" she finally asked. "When my husband died, and I had to figure out how to run a boarding house in the Nevada desert with $12 and an iron skillet," Eliza said. "There is nothing like necessity for clarifying your thinking." The legal resolution came, as these things often do, not with a dramatic courtroom flourish, but with a sequence of practical events that accumulated into an outcome. Philip Drummond in Carson City was a thorough and patient lawyer who understood that the most effective legal arguments were often the least glamorous ones, not sweeping principles but specific, documented facts. He had, at Warren's suggestion and Mabel's agreement, collected statements from Dr. Hensley, who had quietly, professionally noted the state of her wrist when she had come to him for a minor ailment 3 days after her arrival, and from 2 women in Mabel's former neighborhood in Carson City who had, when approached in the right way by the right person, been willing to put in writing what they had observed over the past 2 years about the nature of Gerald Holt's household. Corbin, Gerald's half-trained legal representative, was not equipped for Drummond. The proceedings before the regional judge, which took place in the county seat 20 miles from Dusty Creek, resulted in a formal legal separation with the specific finding that the plaintiff Mabel had reasonable cause to leave the marital home on grounds of physical harm and financial coercion. It was not a divorce, not yet, not in the cleanest terms, but it was legal standing. It was protection. It was the document that said, in the precise dry language of legal writing, "This woman has the right to be where she is." Gerald Holt left Dusty Creek the following day without speaking to Mabel again. He rode back toward Carson City on his gray horse and did not look back, and the only feeling Mabel had watching him go was an absence. The absence of the weight she had been carrying since the morning she had walked off the stage in this town with a bruised wrist and a carpetbag, and the faintly desperate hope that there was something different possible. The absence felt like relief so profound it had a physical dimension, like a door swinging open in a room that had been sealed for years. She stood in the main street of Dusty Creek with the Nevada sun on her face and the fine dust rising around her, and the sound of the town going about its business all around her. And she felt not happy, exactly, not yet, not in the clear, unburdened way she imagined happiness might feel when you were properly arrived at it, but she felt possible. She felt like happiness was a country she was standing at the border of and could see clearly from here. Warren found her there 10 minutes later. He had been at the county seat for the proceedings and ridden back ahead of her, because she had traveled with Drummond in his buggy, and he had been watching from the end of the street. He walked toward her and stopped a few feet away, and they looked at each other in the afternoon light. "It's done," she said. "It's done," he agreed. "Thank you," she said, "for all of it." "You did most of it," he said. "I just provided what I had available to provide." She looked at him for a moment. Then she crossed the 2 feet of distance between them and put her hand in his, just that, just her hand in his large, careful hand, and felt his fingers close around hers with a gentleness that had nothing of possession in it, nothing of claim, only the quality of choosing, the feeling of two people reaching for the same thing at the same time. "I think I am happy here," she said. "Or I will be. I think I am becoming someone who will be." He looked down at their joined hands and then up at her face, and there was something in his expression that was so full of careful, tender feeling that she felt it in her own chest, like a resonance. "That is the best thing I've heard in a long time," he said. They did not rush what came next, because neither of them was inclined to rush, and both of them had good reasons for care. The weeks that followed the legal resolution had a quality of gradual, unfolding rightness. Not the heightened, artificial breathlessness of a courtship conducted under false circumstances, but something more real and more durable. They were two people in a small town who liked each other's company, and were honest about it, and found, repeatedly, that the honesty held up under examination. He began stopping by Eliza's for Sunday supper, not on the rotating basis of community invitation, but because he was invited specifically. And he always came with something: a jar of honey from one of the outlying farms, a small printed book he had picked up when the bookseller's cart came through town, once a length of the most extraordinary green silk that had somehow come in on the rail freight and ended up at Howard Pine's general store, and that Warren had bought the moment he saw it because it was precisely the color of the mountains in the late spring, and he thought she would like it. She had held the silk in her hands and felt the weight of it and looked up at him with something she did not try to suppress. "That is a very thoughtful gift," she said. "I had a selfish motive," he said. "I wanted to see what you would make with it." She made him, eventually, a waistcoat of that silk for his birthday in October. It was the most meticulous piece of needlework she had ever done, and when he put it on and looked down at it and then at her, he said, "I am going to wear this every important day for the rest of my life." She laughed at that, surprised and delighted, and the laugh came from somewhere genuine and unguarded, and he heard it, and something in his expression shifted and opened. October in Dusty Creek had a quality of soft gold in the afternoons, the particular autumn light of the Nevada desert that made even the dust look like it was worth keeping. They walked in that light often, through the edge of town where the houses petered out and the land opened wide, talking and not talking in equal measure, developing the particular rhythm of two people who have decided, without formal announcement, to share their interior lives with each other. He told her about the year before he came to Dusty Creek, when he had been working for a cattle operation in Arizona Territory, and a dispute between the rancher and his workers, many of them Mexican men who had been there before the rancher and would likely be there after, had escalated in the way that these things escalated in that time and place, and he had been on the wrong side of it at first, following orders as men do, and then had understood what was happening and had refused those orders and had ridden away from a good job with nothing but his horse and his principal and several months of uncertainty about what came next. It was not a comfortable story to tell, he said. He did not tell it to make himself look good. He told it because she had asked him once what had shaped him most as a man, and honesty required acknowledging the things that had been difficult to learn. She told him about the longing she had felt as a girl, the one she had never been able to name. She thought she understood it now, she said. It had been the longing to be a self, a complete, particular, chosen self, rather than a role. Daughter, wife, appendage. The longing had been for the simple, radical, apparently revolutionary act of being asked what she wanted and having her answer matter. "I am asking," he said. "Now, what do you want?" She looked at the mountains in the distance, the ones she had been memorizing since the day she arrived, and then she looked at him. "I want to stay here," she said. "I want my work and my income and my own name on the work. I want community and honest friendship and the ability to speak in a room and have it matter. I want," she stopped, gathered herself, continued. "I want you. I want what this is, and I want it to keep being this, to keep being honest and equal and built on a foundation that can hold weight." He was quiet for a moment. The wind moved through the scrub grass at the edge of the trail. "I want to marry you," he said, "when that is possible. When you are ready and when the law allows it. I'm not asking you to decide that now. I'm just telling you that it is what I want so that there is no hidden motive and no secret and you know exactly where I stand." "I know where you stand," she said softly. "I think I have always known where you stand. It is one of the things I love about you." The words sat between them, clear and unretracted. She had not quite planned to say it, but she found she did not want to take it back. He reached over and took her hand. "I love you," he said. "That is not complicated for me. I want you to know it plainly." She tightened her fingers around his. "It is not complicated for me either," she said. "That is perhaps the most astonishing thing I have discovered in Dusty Creek, that it does not have to be complicated." The legal divorce from Gerald Holt was finalized the following March, 1880, through the Nevada District Court, on the grounds of the legal separation already established and the absence of any successful counterpetition from Gerald, who had, by all reports, returned to Carson City, discovered that the community there was less sympathetic to his narrative than he had anticipated, and was chiefly concerned with managing his own reputation. He did not contest the final filing. Drummond wrote to Mabel to tell her it was complete, and his letter arrived on a Tuesday morning in early spring when the desert was doing its brief, improbable thing of blooming, wildflowers coming up through the pale dust in defiance of all reasonable expectation. She read the letter twice. Then she went to the sheriff's office and knocked on the open door, and Warren looked up from his desk and read her expression and stood up. "It is done," she said. He came around the desk and stood in front of her, and she looked up at him. "Will you marry me?" she asked. Because she had decided, sometime in the long and careful winter, that she was done waiting for others to make the first move, that claiming her own life meant claiming this too, actively, with her own voice and her own choice. His smile was the most complete thing she had ever seen on a human face. "Yes," he said. "Obviously, yes." They were married in June of 1880 in the Dusty Creek Church, which was also the schoolroom, in a ceremony conducted by the Methodist minister who came through town on his circuit every 6 weeks. Eliza Booth stood up with Mabel. Howard Pine and his wife stood up with Warren. Clara Finch cried throughout the ceremony with the happy abandon of a woman who feels entitled to cry at weddings and does not care who knows it. Dr. Hensley offered a toast at the supper afterward that was warm and somewhat long and heartfelt in direct proportion to the number of toasts already consumed. Mabel wore a dress she had made herself, ivory cotton with small blue flowers embroidered along the collar and cuffs, simple and precise and unmistakably her own work. She had put weeks into it, not because she needed to prove something, but because making it had felt like a ceremony of its own, each stitch a deliberate act, each hour at the frame a meditation on what she was building. She stood at the front of the small, wood-framed church with the afternoon light coming through the single clear window and Warren beside her and the good people of Dusty Creek behind them. And she made her promises in a clear voice, because she meant them entirely, and she heard him make his in a voice that was steady and warm and entirely certain. And when the minister said the final words and Warren looked at her, she felt the thing she had been trying to describe for months. The thing that had been almost happiness and approaching happiness and standing at the border of happiness. She felt it arrive, fully, unmistakably, like a window thrown open. The first year of their marriage was the kind of year that stays with a person as a reference point for all the years after, not because it was without difficulty, because it was not, but because it had the quality of being genuinely, fundamentally right in a way that made the difficulties navigable. The domestic rhythms they established were built, from the first, on the principle that they were two whole people sharing a life rather than two roles filling a structure, and the difference was everything. Mabel kept her sewing work and expanded it. By the end of 1880, she had more commissions than she could easily fulfill and had begun to think about whether there might be a proper workroom, a proper shop of her own, something with a sign on the front, and a chair for clients and shelving for fabric samples arranged by color and weight. She mentioned this to Warren over supper one evening with the slight tentativeness of someone testing whether a dream is sturdy enough to say out loud. He put down his fork and looked at her. "Where on the main street?" he asked. She stared at him for a second. "I had not gotten that far." "The space next to Howard Pines has been empty since the apothecary moved to the larger building in the spring," he said. "The rent is reasonable. Howard would be a good neighbor." He picked up his fork again. "Tell me when you want to go look at it." She went and looked at it the following morning and the morning after that, and on the third morning she stood in the empty rectangular room with the window that faced west and the smell of old wood and dust, and she knew. She opened Mabel Reed Mercer's Dressmaking and Alterations in February of 1881. She put the sign up herself, standing on the boardwalk in the cold morning air with a hammer and Warren beside her holding the sign steady. And when the last nail went in, she stepped back and looked at her name on the front of a building that was hers. And the feeling was so large she could not put it into words, and so she did not try. The shop became, within the year, one of the anchor businesses of the main street. Women came from the outlying ranches and farms, sometimes making half a day's trip, for work they could not get anywhere else within 50 miles. Mabel hired a young woman named Rosa Delgado, whose family had been in the territory for generations, and who had an extraordinary eye for color and a natural facility with embroidery that Mabel recognized and nurtured with the care of someone who knew what it meant to have a skill that nobody saw. Rosa learned quickly and worked brilliantly, and within 18 months was doing work that could stand alongside Mabel's, which Mabel recognized and paid for accordingly. Warren observed all of this with a pride that was uncomplicated by ego, the pride of someone who had believed in a thing and watched it come true. He told her once, when she was frustrated by a particularly difficult commission and questioning whether she had taken on too much, that he had never once doubted she was capable of anything she decided to do, that the only question had always been what she would decide. "That is," she said, looking up at him from the tangle of fabric in her lap, "an extraordinarily annoying thing to say to someone who is frustrated." "Is it wrong?" he asked. She looked at the fabric, then at him. "No," she admitted. "It is not wrong." He grinned at her, the particular grin she had come to know as reserved for moments when he was pleased with himself, and she threw a length of blue ribbon at him, and he caught it and laughed, and the sound filled the room. In the spring of 1882, Mabel discovered she was expecting. She told Warren on a Sunday evening when the town was quiet, and the light through the parlor window was the gold of late afternoon, and she watched his face do the thing it did when something hit him deeply, a brief stillness, then a particular brightness, like a lamp being turned up. He came to her and held her face in both hands and looked at her with an expression that was beyond what she had words for. "Are you happy?" he asked, And then he stopped and something flickered across his expression and he said, "Are you frightened?" "Both things," she said, "equally." And that was all right, and he said he understood and he meant it. Their son was born in October of 1882 in the room above the boarding house where Mabel had first stayed, because Eliza had insisted on being present and the boarding house was where Eliza was, and there was no arguing with Eliza on the subject of anything she had decided. Dr. Hensley attended. Warren spent the hours of labor in the room, holding her hand and saying nothing that needed to be said and being present in the way that was simply himself. They named the boy Thomas James Mercer Thomas for Mabel's father, which was a complicated gift but a genuine one, a way of acknowledging where she had come from without being defined by it, and James for Warren's oldest brother in Texas who was a good man and had always been kind to him. Thomas James was a loud, opinionated infant who grew into a loud, opinionated child with his father's dark eyes and his mother's precise, particular stubbornness. He was, from the first, entirely himself. Eliza Booth became his honorary grandmother with an efficiency that suggested she had been waiting for the role her whole life. She informed Warren and Mabel of this fact 3 days after the birth, standing in the doorway of their house with a covered dish of something that smelled excellent, and neither of them was in any position to argue, and both of them were, in truth, grateful. Life in Dusty Creek continued to move. The town grew, the rail line brought more people, and more people brought more commerce and more complexity and occasionally more trouble. Warren's work as sheriff was never exactly simple, but he was good at it in the way that mattered most, which was not the way of guns and drama, but the way of presence and consistency, of being someone the town knew it could count on. He was re-elected by the town council in 1883 without opposition, which was not nothing in a town where opinions were freely held and freely expressed. When the council chairman told him the result, he came home and told Mabel about it at the supper table, matter-of-factly, and Thomas James, who was 18 months old and sitting in the chair Mabel had had Howard Pine build to the right height for him, banged his spoon on the table in what everyone agreed was approval. In 1884, Mabel and Rosa expanded the shop into the adjacent space that had opened up, adding a proper fitting room with a mirror she had ordered from a San Francisco catalog, and that arrived swathed in so much packing paper it took an hour to unwrap. Rosa, who was by now more partner than employee, took on the management of the new fitting room appointments with characteristic competence, and Mabel, who was pregnant again, was grateful for it. Their second child, a girl born in August of 1884, was named Clara Rose Clara for Clara Finch, who had cried at their wedding and continued to cry at all subsequent significant occasions and was entirely unembarrassed about it, and Rose for Rosa Delgado, who had become, in the way of the best professional relationships, something close to family. Clara Rose had Mabel's coloring, the warm brown hair, the hazel eyes, and her father's way of going very still and very attentive when something interested her, which made her seem, from very early, like someone who was taking notes. The family they were building was, in all its daily and ordinary details, the specific and irreplaceable thing that Mabel had longed for from the kitchen window in Carson City, without knowing its name. It was noisy and imperfect, and full of the small friction and negotiation of people who actually lived alongside each other rather than performing a life for an audience. They argued sometimes about money, about decisions regarding the shop, about how to handle Thomas James's pronounced opinion that he should not be required to go to sleep when declared, and the arguments had the particular quality of arguments between equals, where both people's positions were genuinely considered, and where the outcome was arrived at rather than decreed. She had not known before that this was possible, that two people could build something together and have both of them be genuinely inside it. Warren knew it. He had not always known it. His own family, while not cruel, had operated on a traditional hierarchy that he had absorbed without examination, until certain events in Arizona territory had made him examine a great many of his unexamined assumptions. He had spent the years since trying to rebuild from first principles, and Mabel was, in the specific and irreplaceable way of the right person at the right time, both the reason and the reward. He told her this one evening years later, when Thomas James was 5 and Clara Rose was 3, and both of them were asleep with the profound abandonment of small children, and the house was quiet, and they were sitting on the porch in the evening air as they had sat on the boardwalk outside his office in the early days, watching the sky go from orange to deep violet. "I think about the morning you walked into my office," he said, "with that look on your face." "Which look?" she asked. "The one where you were terrified and you were not going to show it," he said. "The one where you had decided something and you were going to see it through regardless." "I was terrified," she confirmed. "I know, but you came in anyway." He looked at the darkening sky. "I want you to know that I think about that a great deal, about the courage it took to come to a strange town and start again. I want you to know that I have never once forgotten that I am in my life with you because you were brave enough to leave a life that was wrong." She looked at him in the evening light. "You helped," she said, "considerably." "I held a door," he said. "You walked through it." She leaned her head against his shoulder. He put his arm around her. "Are you happy here?" he asked. And there was something deliberately echoing in it, the first question, the one that had started everything, and she heard the echo and smiled against his shoulder. "Yes," she said, "I'm very happy here." "Good," he said, and the word carried everything, all the care and the steadiness and the years of shared ordinary and extraordinary life. "Good, yes, here, enough." The years continued to unroll with the particular richness of lives actually being lived. Mabel's shop grew into the most successful dressmaking establishment within 100 miles, a fact that she received with satisfaction rather than surprise, because she had put the work in and she knew the quality of it. Rosa Delgado eventually became a full partner, her name going on the sign, Reed Mercer and Delgado Fine Dressmaking, and the day that sign went up was celebrated with a supper at Eliza's that included most of the main street and went past 10 in the evening. Rosa married a man named Felix Castillo, who worked the assay office and had a meticulous mind and a gentle way of being in the world that Mabel recognized and approved of, and the two families became entangled in the warm, comfortable way of people who have chosen each other as their people. Thomas James grew into a boy who was clever and curious and possessed, to Warren's mixed pride and exhaustion, of an exceptional sense of justice that led him to argue on behalf of anyone he perceived as being treated unfairly, including the schoolteacher, whom he informed one afternoon that a particular rule was inconsistent with principles of fairness. The schoolteacher, who had been at her job for 20 years, sent a note home to Warren and Mabel that said, in its entirety, "Your son is going to be a lawyer. I recommend you begin preparing." Clara Rose grew into a girl who watched everything, who drew careful, detailed pictures of the people and places around her, with an attention to physical accuracy that made everyone who saw them stop and look twice, who at age 7 declared that she intended to be a painter, and at age 12 had produced work that Mabel displayed in the shop and that customers asked to purchase. In 1888, Mabel's mother Edna came to visit, the first time they had seen each other since the morning Mabel left Carson City. It was a visit proposed carefully in a letter that had been in correspondence for over a year, a slow, deliberate rebuilding of something that had been broken by necessity rather than malice. Edna Reed had, in the years of her daughter's absence, done some of her own hard thinking, and the woman who stepped off the stage in Dusty Creek was quieter and more direct than the woman Mabel had left behind. They were careful with each other for the first 2 days. On the third day, they sat together in the shop after closing, Edna watching Mabel work on the final details of an elaborate commission, and Edna said, "I should have asked you what you wanted. When you were 19, I should have asked." Mabel set down her needle. "I know you did what you believed was right," she said. "I did what was easy," Edna said. "That is not the same thing." It was not a full reconciliation in an afternoon, but it was a true thing said, and a true thing heard, and over the 3 weeks of the visit, in the small accumulations of daily life, something was rebuilt that was sturdier than what had been there before. Warren was gracious and kind to Edna in the particular way of a man who understood exactly what his wife needed from him in this situation, which was warmth extended to her mother, and no judgment about the complicated terrain between them. Edna watched him quietly with the eye of a woman who had learned to look more carefully than she once had, and on the morning before she left she told Mabel, "He sees you." "Yes," Mabel said. "He does." "That is," Edna said, "what I should have looked for, when looking mattered." She said it without self-pity, just with the plain accounting of a woman who had arrived at clarity too late for some things and not too late for others. She hugged her daughter at the stage and held on for a long time, and Mabel held back, and Thomas James watched this from his father's side with the fascinated attention of a child absorbing information about the adult world. In 1890, the town of Dusty Creek incorporated formally, with a proper town charter and an elected council, and a new courthouse that smelled of fresh lumber and aspiration. Warren ran for town marshal, the upgraded position that the new charter created, corresponding to the more formal civic structure, and won by a margin that said something about what the town thought of him that 11 years of daily conduct had established. He came home on the night of the election to find Mabel and Eliza and Clara Finch and Rosa all in the parlor, having clearly been there most of the evening, and Thomas James sitting importantly on the stairs pretending he was not supposed to be awake. "Well?" Mabel asked. He held up the vote tally. She took it and read the numbers and set it on the table. "Did you ever doubt it?" she asked. "I don't take things for granted," he said. "No," she agreed. "That is one of your many excellent qualities." Eliza Booth, who was 72 years old and not one bit less sharp than she had been at 60, raised her glass of cooking sherry. She had produced it from somewhere. She always produced it from somewhere, and said, "To the town marshal, and to the woman who has put up with him." "To both of them," Rosa amended, and everyone drank. Eliza Booth died in the summer of 1891, in her sleep, in her own bed in her own boarding house, which was exactly as she would have specified if she had been consulted about it, which she probably had been in the form of precise instructions left with her attorney. She left the boarding house to a young couple she had taken under her wing in her last years, and she left Mabel a letter that was brief and direct and said, among other things, "You came here with nothing but yourself, and it turned out that was more than enough. I am glad I got to watch you figure that out." Mabel wept at the funeral in a way she had not wept since arriving in Dusty Creek, the deep, genuine grief of losing someone irreplaceable. Warren sat beside her and held her hand and said nothing because there was nothing adequate to say and he knew it, and his presence was enough. Thomas James, who was 9 years old, asked afterward in the direct way of children, "Did she know we loved her?" "Yes," Mabel said. "She absolutely knew." He considered this. "Good," he said, unconsciously echoing his father's word for the deepest things, and Mabel's breath caught at the recognition of it. The 1890s brought changes to Dusty Creek as they brought changes to every corner of the West, the frontier closing in the way that things close, not all at once but incrementally, the wild giving way to the settled, the temporary becoming permanent, the rough becoming refined. The railroad brought more people than cattle or silver had, and the town's character shifted slowly from outpost to community. Mabel's shop adapted with it. As women's fashion moved and changed, she moved and changed with it, keeping current through the fashion papers that arrived by mail and through the network of correspondence she had built over the years with dressmakers in Reno and San Francisco, and even, occasionally, New York. She was not interested in merely copying what came from elsewhere. She made it particular to this place, to these women, to the specific needs and aesthetics of women who lived real lives in a real landscape. There was a moment in 1893 when a woman from San Francisco, visiting a relative in Dusty Creek, saw one of Mabel's pieces at a Sunday gathering, and asked where it had come from, and came to the shop the following morning, and placed an order for 4 dresses, and asked whether Mabel would consider working with clients in the city. Mabel thanked her and said she did not think so, that she was where she needed to be. The San Francisco woman looked around the shop, at the fabric samples and the careful order of it, at Rosa working in the fitting room, at the view through the west window of the Nevada desert. "I can see that," the woman said, with a note of sincere surprise. Warren turned 50 in 1898. The town threw him a party he had not known was coming, which was a feat in a community of people not known for keeping secrets, and his expression when he walked into the town hall and found it full of everyone he had spent the better part of his adult life working with and working for was the most unguarded Mabel had ever seen him in public. He looked, briefly, entirely overwhelmed. Thomas James, 16 and in the first stages of learning how to be a man, and understanding it was more complicated than he had initially estimated, gave a speech at the party that made the entire room laugh, and then go quiet in that way that means what is being said has landed true. "My father," Thomas James said, "is the person I have watched my whole life to learn how to be in the world. Not because he is perfect, he is not, and he will not pretend he is, but because he is honest about that. He does the work. He asks what people need instead of assuming he knows. He sees people." He paused. "I have been told I am going to be a lawyer. I think what that means is that I am going to try to be the kind of person who sees people like he taught me to, but with more paperwork." The room laughed. Warren put his arm around Mabel's shoulders and she leaned into him, and he said quietly for only her, "Did you know he was going to say that?" "No," she said, "but I am not surprised." "Neither am I," he said, and there was a pride in his voice that was the purest thing she had ever heard. Clara Rose, at 14, was already selling paintings. She had a sense of the world that translated onto canvas with a confidence that Mabel recognized, the confidence of someone who had always been allowed to believe their perspective was worth something, who had grown up in a household where what you saw and thought and felt was taken seriously as data. She painted the desert, the people, the light. She painted her mother at the sewing frame with a quality of concentration in the canvas figure that made people who saw it say, "I know that feeling." In 1900, Thomas James left for law school in San Francisco, the first member of the Mercer family in any direction to receive a formal higher education. He left on the train in September, tall and certain and slightly terrified, and Mabel stood on the platform and held him for a long moment. "Write often," she said. "Every week," he promised. "Don't let the city teach you to be afraid of being wrong," she said. He looked at her. "Was that advice for me or advice you wish someone had given you?" She laughed, caught out. "Both," she said, "clearly both." Warren shook his son's hand and then, departing from the formal mode, embraced him instead, and Thomas James gripped his father's back with the force of someone who does not entirely know how to say what they feel, and Warren said into his shoulder, "I am proud of you. That will not change regardless of what happens." The train pulled away in a cloud of steam and noise, and Thomas James's arm out the window, and they stood on the platform until it was out of sight. Mabel took Warren's hand. "He will be fine," she said. "I know," Warren said. "So will we." They walked back to town together through the September morning, and the world was wide around them, and the mountains were purple in the distance. And Dusty Creek was the same as it had been, and also completely different from what it had been, in the way that all true things are both. 3 years later, in 1903, Thomas James returned from San Francisco with a law degree and a wife named Grace, whom he had met in a boarding house operated by a woman who reminded him, he said, of someone he had grown up knowing, a woman who ran her establishment with efficient competence and a sharp tongue and a kind heart. Grace was 24 years old, the daughter of Chinese immigrants who had come to California during the railroad construction years and built a life under circumstances that demanded extraordinary resilience. She was precise and thoughtful and had a quality of stillness that people underestimated until they were in an argument with her and discovered it was not passivity but the deep calm of someone very sure of their position. Mabel loved her immediately and completely, which she told Warren as soon as she had a private moment with him after the introductions. "I could see that," he said, "from across the room." "Is it obvious?" she asked. "Only to me," he said. "Because I know what you look like when you recognize someone." Clara Rose, who was 19 and home from the small but serious art school in Reno where she had been studying for 2 years, looked at Grace with the appraising eye of someone who was always looking for subject matter and announced, "I want to paint you." Grace said, "All right." Thomas James looked at his sister. "Most people ask first." She said, "All right," Clara Rose pointed out, and Thomas James could not argue with this. The family that gathered around the table in Warren and Mabel's house in the October of 1903 was not the family either of them had been born into, but it was the family they had built, and it had the particular weight and warmth of something constructed on purpose, with care, with full knowledge of what they were doing and why. Mabel looked down the table at Warren at the other end, who was listening to Thomas James describe some procedural complexity of his new law practice, in the patient way of a man who cares about what his son is saying more than he cares about understanding every detail of it. And she thought about a question asked on a boardwalk by a man with a wounded dog in his lap. "Are you happy here?" Nobody had ever thought to ask, and that first asking had changed everything. She caught Warren's eye across the table and he looked at her with that particular look, the one that was only ever for her, the one that held everything, all the years, all the mornings, all the evenings on the porch watching the desert light change, all the ordinary days that were the fabric of a life actually lived. He raised his glass slightly, just to her, a private thing in the middle of the crowded table. She raised hers back. In the spring of 1905, Mabel received a letter from her youngest sister Alina in Carson City, who was 28 and unhappy in ways she could not quite articulate but that Mabel recognized instantly, reading between the careful formal lines. She wrote back immediately, a long letter, the kind she had learned to write over years of correspondence, direct and honest and full of information that could be actually used. She told Alina about Dusty Creek. She told her about the work available, about Eliza's boarding house still operating under its new management, about what it had been like to start again. She told her that the most frightening thing is also frequently the most necessary thing. She told her that it is not selfish to want a life that feels like yours. She told her that nobody is going to hand you your own happiness. You have to go and take it, which is terrifying and also worth it. She did not tell her what to do. She asked what Alina wanted, and she waited for an answer. Alina arrived in Dusty Creek in July. She stepped off the stage with a carpetbag, which made Mabel laugh so suddenly and so genuinely that Alina looked alarmed. "I will explain later," Mabel said, and embraced her sister and brought her home. Warren shook Alina's hand and said, "Welcome to Dusty Creek." And then, "Are you hungry?" Mabel made pie. Alina, who had spent 2 days on a stage coach from Carson City and was indeed hungry, said yes, she was, and Warren led her into the house and Mabel followed, watching the familiar and the new sitting down together at the table that was always big enough for one more. That evening, after Alina was settled in the guest room and Warren and Mabel were alone on the porch in the summer dark, warm and full of the sound of the desert and the distant light of the stars, Mabel said, "I want to ask you something." "Anything," he said. "Are you happy here?" she asked. He turned to look at her, and in the starlight his expression was so full and so simple that it needed no elaboration. "I am extraordinarily happy here," he said. "I have been happy here since the morning a woman walked into my office with a carpetbag and more courage than she knew she had and looked at me like I might be a trap, and turned out to be the best thing that ever happened to this office and this town and this life." She leaned against him. "Good," she said. "That is very good." The stars moved overhead in the old way of stars, unhurried and without agenda, and the Nevada desert breathed its dry, warm breath. and the town of Dusty Creek settled into its evening quiet. And in the house behind them, a door opened and closed as Alina went to the kitchen for water. And in the upstairs room, Clara Rose's lamp was still lit as she worked on a new canvas. And somewhere to the east, Thomas James and Grace were settled in their house with their life building day by day around them. And the whole long, beautiful, complicated, ordinary, extraordinary life that had been made from a single question asked on a boardwalk by a man with a wounded dog in his lap, unfolded backward and forward in every direction, permanent and true, and full of the kind of happiness that does not require asking about because it is already the answer.